You're used to seeing Emily Chang grill the biggest names in tech on her shows Bloomberg West and Studio 1.0. Today, we turn the tables on her to get some tips on how best to handle an interview, as well as her thoughts on the current state of the industry, including exploding watermelons. So you report on startups every day for Bloomberg West. Want to talk about Studio 1.0. It's a different form factor than we're used to seeing in news. Long form, more in-depth interviews, and this is the 4th season now. What was sort of the inspiration behind it, and why do this type of format?
So Studio 1.0 was really like a dream passion side project of mine, and I had no idea where it would go. I still do Bloomberg West every day, daily news show, and we talk to really interesting and informed people, but sometimes we only get like 5 minutes with them. And I really wanted the opportunity to go more in depth, find out, who these people are, how they got there, what's their vision for the future. Chamath Palihapitiya, for example, he's been on my show a lot, but nobody necessarily knows that he immigrated from Sri Lanka and slept on a mattress in a 1-bedroom apartment with his siblings in Canada. Or that, Ariana Huffington, grew up with a single mom and was told she would never get into Cambridge, and look at where she is today. So those are the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell, and it's just become a great compliment to what we do every day. And I still love doing it. And every time it's so funny, every time I finish an interview on Studio 1.0, I think it's like the best one ever, or my mind is blown. I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunity to do it.
Is sort of a core idea behind it, though, that are sort of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and other people that you have on the show, CEOs, like sort of the new Hollywood movie stars, rock stars, and that's sort of like the interest that comes from the show? I
mean, there's a tremendous fascination with Silicon Valley right now. There's an HBO show about it, and there's so many people who, want to come to Silicon Valley and live the dream and start a company, and I think there's just a lot of curiosity about how these people got to where they are. And, one thing you'll find is, at least that I've found, is it's not a lot of luck. It's a lot of hard work and maybe some happy coincidences along the way. But these people are incredibly passionate and incredibly driven and incredibly ambitious. And, that's how they got to where they are.
So backing up for a second, how did you get here? How did you get to Bloomberg even before Studio 1.0?
So I got here the long, hard, traditional way. I, had internships in college at newsrooms. I idolized Katie Couric. I just loved that she was the girl next door. I loved how curious she was and how human she was on the Today Show. And I started off behind the scenes at NBC. Actually, I worked a little bit at the Today Show. I worked a little bit at Dateline. And then I got my first on-air job in Birmingham, Alabama. And I was covering house fires and homicides and city council meetings. And I worked my way up through local markets. I ended up at CNN in London. And in 2008, they asked if I wanted to move to China and be their correspondent in China and cover the Olympics. And it was amazing and crazy, and I traveled a lot. And Bloomberg actually came to me and asked if I was interested in launching a show in San Francisco about the rise of Silicon Valley. And I really didn't have much business experience at the time. I covered Facebook getting shut down in China and Twitter and Google leaving the country and currency fluctuations, but I'd never lived in this world or covered this world solely. And so when I got here, I had a lot to learn. I had a steep learning curve, but I absolutely love it. I feel like I get to interview the smartest and most interesting people in the world, people who are actually changing the world, and it's an everyday education. And I'm so grateful that I've had this opportunity.
And so to that end, when you do interview people now, how do you get them to open up? And are you trying to pry for news? Are you just trying to have a conversation with them? How do you kick things off?
I think that listening is one of the most underestimated skills in interviewing. It's really important to be a good listener. It's something that I've had to work really hard at, because when you're doing an interview, especially a live interview, you're thinking about the next question and You're not necessarily listening to what's happening in the moment. And sometimes people will say things or, reveal things that you didn't expect, and it might take the conversation in a different direction, but it's worth it to go there. I definitely do my homework. I come in with a plan, certain questions or themes I want to explore, but I try to be flexible. And I think we talked about what makes, some of the people that we're covering successful. I have a genuine curiosity about what I'm covering, and I'm actually interested in what these people are saying. And I also think that having a sense of empathy is really important. Like, being in this chair is really scary, and I know that, and I'm so, I really appreciate that people are willing to put themselves out there, and I think, it's fair to, make them feel comfortable and give them a chance to say what they want to say.
How hard do you push if they don't want to talk?
I think that every interview needs to be fair, and that you have to ask the tough questions. So, I'll push to the extent, if someone says to me, look, I'm not going to answer that question, or I'm not prepared to answer that question, or that's not what this interview is about, I accept that. And I actually appreciate that. What I don't like is when people try to answer the question but don't answer the question and basically pretend that they're answering it, but they're really not.
Right.
I just prefer, straight up, we're not ready to reveal that information, or we're not, we don't have those numbers for you today, but here's what I can tell you.
So obviously being on television, this is an interesting time, with the media landscape sort of shifting, and online video is like the comparable element that a lot of different media entities are trying to get into. How important do you still view television itself as a medium to get a message out?
There's no question that television audiences, especially in cable news, have declined, but I think there's still a core audience. Bloomberg is still on in the background of a lot of trading floors and offices, and so I think the traditional linear television component is still a very important part of our audience. But we are, Bloomberg is readily available live, on demand, on different platforms. That's really important to us. We've really focused on our digital strategy, and the whole show is available online in bite-sized pieces. For example, we have a social team that's promoting things on Facebook and Twitter. So I think in this media landscape, you have to be willing to experiment on a lot of different platforms and invest in different platforms, and who knows where it's going. But I think as long as you're producing good content and memorable content, then hopefully you're in good shape.
So some of the people you've interviewed, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Aaron Sorkin, a bunch of others, do you notice a common thread? I know this is sort of a complicated question, everyone's different, but is there a common thread amongst the people that you've had on the show?
I think I would go back to ambition and passion and drive. Like, Aaron Sorkin was writing plays on napkins while he was tending bar and stuffing them in his pockets. He, had this dream, and he went after it. And Mark Zuckerberg, we now know he's a hacker at heart. He has stayed so true to his vision of trying to connect the world, even when there was so much pressure from venture capitalists or, companies to sell. He never did. And Sheryl Sandberg, to me, she is a huge inspiration to me, especially as a working mom. She's one of the most successful business executives in the world. She turned Facebook into a powerhouse, and she's put herself out there on women's issues. And I know it actually hasn't been easy. It's been controversial, but it's been really important for me as a woman, and I think for a lot of other women out there, to see that, yes, you can do it.
Talking a little bit more about that, obviously that's a common theme that comes up time and time again, both on your show and the overall sort of tech ecosystem, women in technology, women in the workplace. Would love your thoughts on how everything is going, even in the people that you talk to and have as guests on the show. What's your perspective, and how has it evolved sort of since the beginning?
I think we're talking about it a lot more, and we need to make sure it's not just talk, but I do think that talk is, to a certain extent, progress. Like, we're talking about it a lot more than we were 5 years ago when I got here, at least. And what we're seeing is a lot more startups thinking about this earlier in their life cycle, like Slack, like Pinterest and Airbnb. And one of the things I think companies have learned is that if you don't do this early, it's going to be really hard to change it down the line. That's why Facebook and Google and Apple have lopsided workforces, and it's not necessarily that they don't care about it right now, but once you get to that size, it's really hard to move the needle. And these companies are just experimenting, and they're learning, and they're evolving, and it's not going to be perfect. Nobody's going to be perfect, but I certainly think that trying is really important.
Is that important for you too, to have more women on the show? We talked about Sheryl Sandberg, you've had Ariana Huffington and a few others. Like, is it hard to find people to actually bring onto the show?
It's really important to me to have women on the show, and a lot of women, because of some of the barriers that they faced in the workplace and in technology in particular, haven't been promoted to CEO. And so, it's something that I've worked hard to look for women that, have great stories that I want to tell. And, I think that even I can do better, and we can do better in getting more women on the show, and, women entrepreneurs, for example, the people who aren't so obvious. So yes, it's really important to me, and I think we can all do better.
So sort of from a macro perspective, you've been covering Silicon Valley since around 2011 now. How do you view it these days? A lot of talk of, I think since probably, you said you started at Bloomberg around 2008, I guess around the last downturn, right? Overall economic downturn.
2000. So I got to San Francisco in 2010.
Okay.
Right.
And it feels like every year people talk about a bubble, and some of those years that ends up being correct, some not. We are in a little bit of a interesting time right now, it seems. But how do you view it?
So when I got here, we were coming out of a downturn, and Uber and Airbnb had been founded, and they were starting to find their legs. I think you were one of the first people to cover Uber in the early days. It was just this little black car app, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, and people laughed at it. And obviously, we know where Uber and Airbnb are today. And over the last 5 years that I've been covering Silicon Valley, there's been a lot of exuberance, sometimes irrational exuberance, and I think right now you're starting to see a bit of a reality check. And I'm not an economist, but I do ask people this very same question all the time, and it certainly seems like we're going into a downturn. It's not going to look like it looked in 99, 2000. Some people have said it's a slow deflate. I think there'll be a softer landing, but I think we're moving into a period where we're going to see just how many of these unicorns are really unicorns, and which companies will survive.
And sort of riffing off of that, but also going back a bit to the media landscape, we're hearing reports more now of sort of some of the newer upstarts in the media not doing as great as maybe they had been suggested to be doing previously, and in terms of fundraising wise. How do you think that sort of new media is doing, looking at it from, hate to call Bloomberg old media, but it is more traditional media? How do you think new media is doing?
So I think that, first of all, anybody in the media business should have a healthy dose of paranoia, and I do as well. I'm watching the competition. Only the paranoid survive. And, I think we have a lot to learn from companies like BuzzFeed, that you can just explode a watermelon on video and 1 million people will come and watch. And,
So are you ready to put the watermelon right in the middle of the table?
I actually have one. And like I said before, we've been experimenting with digital platforms and investing heavily in our own website and our own social outreach. But I think one thing that seems to be for sure is that video is where it's at right now. Video is rich content. You can't replicate it. It's original. You can't just pull a quote from it. You have to actually watch it. You have to engage with it. But it also has to be good. And I think if you're producing memorable content, people will find it, but we just don't know necessarily how or what the platforms of the future will be.
So last thing, which I think will be helpful to companies in the GV portfolio, any entrepreneur really, when someone is sitting across from you in an interview like this, what tips do you have for them? How do they you've talked a little bit about how best to not approach a topic that they don't want to approach, but what other tips do you have for someone who in general has to speak outwardly about their company?
I think the most important thing is to be authentic and be yourself. And I know it's really hard to be in this chair, and it's really scary, and you could, practice for hours and it all escapes you in this moment. But you can't go wrong with being yourself. I do think it's important to prepare, to maybe practice with a friend, walk through different scenarios, different questions you may be asked. and have a few things you want to get across, but also be willing to be flexible and go with the flow a little bit. And I know it's scary, but we like telling good stories. We all saw the press release. We want to hear something new or something personal or something different that moves the story forward.